Yeah, that's right. Just hold it up for the next hour or something. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, you guys are live.
All right. Thank you very much, Jacob. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Andrew Klavan and I were just trying to figure out when last we met. And I'm going to embarrass him once again by saying I remember when last we didn't meet, because when I asked him to come, he said he was just going to hide under his desk. I don't know what that said about me, or what did that say about you?
No, it's just that was all about me. I've been most of my life. I have been virtually a hermit. Very, very private. Now I've been thrust out into the public world, and so I've gotten much more used to it. I'm much more metal plated than I was.
Well, that's an interesting thought. And you're right. Writers are not necessarily performers. And sometimes, it's a big strain. But anyway, here we are on Zoom, where he can be in the safety of his home. And
I actually am under my desk at the moment. So
oh, well, very good. And I'm in my library, which I like, because the problem is that I have to then borrow my husband and the puppies from this part of the house. And at the moment, if you hear weird noises, you'll love this. It should have been your last book, your Christmas book. Outside is a giant tower truck, and they are winding lights around our giant saguaro, which
Wow.
they're turning on tonight, and they'll be there for the holidays. There's these weird noises. I'm hoping there won't be a scream of agony as one of them falls from the bucket down.
So you have a Christmas cactus. I like it. Yeah.
It is, and it's a really giant saguaro, So they're out there, as I say, in buckets doing all that. But we're not talking about Andrew's last book, When Christmas Comes, but rather the second book in the Cameron Winter series, which does not have a Christmas theme, but actually has some very existential questions, if you read it all the way through, about God, the existence of God, what God means to us. Is there even one? Questions that you can't answer, Andrew, and neither could I.
No, but you can explore them, and it does change your life if you do.
You can. So I was looking up, I just dropped something on the floor. By the way, I forgot. This is an autograph copy. Andrew was kind enough to sign. You can see the signature. A nice order of A Strange Habit of Mind for us. So I hope that you will take advantage of that, because, we're getting to the gift giving season, right? So books are wonderful gifts. They have eternal shelf life. They don't rot. They formulate discussion. They're escapism. You can learn stuff. You can debate questions. You can keep yourself company. You can share with others. It's amazing, and all for a fairly reasonable price, given what today's entertainment costs. Do you know what it costs to take a family to Disneyland right now? I'd be terrified to look.
Oh no, it's incredible. I've done it not that long ago, a couple of years ago, and it's crippling. Yeah, and it's not as much fun as it used to be either. So.
Oh, well, that's because we're old, but it is for kids. But I mean, even the cost, somebody said that the other day, even the cost of going to the movies, and you buy popcorn is more than a book. So Yep. There we are. Cameron Winter, an interesting character. I love the idea that he's an English professor or teacher and a former spy. Where did you come up with that, particular combination?
Well, this is a strange experience for me, because I've never written a series before. I've written trilogies, but I've never written something that I expected to be a long-running series. And he was created, as I've always created my characters, for a story. I've always thought to match the perfect character with the story, and that's what brings the story to life. But he was so multifaceted and so it spoke to me so immediately that I thought, no, this is the first time I've ever written a character that I actually believe I could string for at least 10 stories and really make him work. So I brought him in for When Christmas Comes. I knew what the story was going to be. I knew it was going to be a Christmas story. I wanted a guy with a certain specific set of problems, which just deepened for me as I was writing the story. And I think that it's really the idea that he is a man with a kind of a dark past, but a man with a sense of beauty and a real yearning to find love in the world, which he's never been able to do, and his dark past kind of holds him back. And all of those things just kind of spoke to me, and they spoke to me about the time we're in, and the sort of person that the culture is looking for. I've been watching, we went through a period around the turn of the century, around 2000 and moving on for about 10, 15 years of a golden age of crime stories on television. And there were The Sopranos, and there was Breaking Bad, and there was The Shield. I mean, terrific, terrific shows. But I noticed that all of them were essentially about anti-heroes. And there's this philosopher, Rene Girard, who says when the culture is in a tragic phase, it can't produce heroes, it can only produce anti-heroes. Yeah. And I think it's very true. And I think what I see the culture looking for is what is a good man? How do you become a good man? And that is essentially Winter's problem. He went out to be a hero. He worked for his country. The things he did weigh on him. He has a lot of blood on his hands, and he's looking for what it means to be a good man. And that's really a complicated question. I mean, when you think of good men, you always think of people who are defined by the evil they're fighting. They're cops fighting crime, and doctors fighting disease, and firemen fighting fires. There's always got to be something bad there for the man to fight. But he's tried that already. He started out doing that, fighting America's enemies, which is a worthy thing to do, but it didn't really work out that well for him. And he's now looking for something else. He's looking for something beautiful and something loving, and he's trying to become that person. And it's a very hard thing to do. And he keeps being drawn back into these kind of criminal stories where he can do what it is he's good at. And I just find him I find him very poignant and very fascinating to follow.
You've raised such an interesting question. Is it possible to be good in the absence of bad?
Yeah, no, and I think there have been over the years, really interesting answers to that. But it is an interesting thing. You don't think of, after all, you think of the saints, and they just kind of sit there. Sometimes they're hermits. They think about things. They have spiritual experiences. But do they actually accomplish good in the world? And I think sometimes they do. I think they do. But Winter, because of his love of poetry, he starts out with his love of poetry. He's already got that from the very beginning. This love of beauty and this love of depth and this love of vision. But he goes astray, kind of looking for things that are what a young man does in the world. He's, as a young man, he goes off and he says, I'm full of juice, and I'm full of energy, and I want to do something in the world. And he goes off and he does something he's not quite sure whether he made a mistake or not. And I think I don't know, it's just a very, very it's a situation full of nuance and questions that he has to explore. And when you talked about talking about God, I think that's one of the questions that he has to explore. I mean, do you need that to become a good man?
So in this discussion, you can already determine that Cameron Winter is not a young man. Because a young man wouldn't even be thinking most of the time quite like this, because as Andrew points out, he'd be looking at the world, figuring out his place in the world. Andrew, interestingly enough, I've had a bunch of discussions with authors in my daily Zooms, probably certainly well over 900 in the last 3 years. And one of the things we talk about is our need to heroes may explain why the Marvel universe is like captured, cinema. And, in these awful times, and we are in I think, an extremely difficult, dangerous, and very uncertain, unpredictable world. We yearn for heroes. We really want, Jack Reacher, we really want him to, fall off the bus and whatever it is, and in his own knight errant way, because he's really classic Thomas Mallory. I mean, so funny that a British guy designed the classic American Western novel. But anyway, we all wish there were some sort of champion to tilt against it. But the problem I think we're having at the moment is that with all the disinformation, truth is very hard to pin down. It's elusive, it's shape-shifting. It's very difficult for people to know what to believe. I had the experience, I went in finally to have a pedicure yesterday, and I was stuck in front of a large TV, and I couldn't believe how vicious the TV ads were. I mean, I don't watch TV, other than Netflix for movies and stuff, or my favorite channel, MHZ TV. And I was horrified. I was truly horrified by the vitriol and the untruths and the slanting and the whole bit. And really, and I suppose to be even-handed from both sides. I don't know that, we could say it was all coming from one side or the other. So this next few days are a tough time to even be talking about this question when we all sort of wish we could hide under our desks. Sorry, I'm
Well,
doing
no, this is, this is a very specific moment, which is one of the things that captures me about this character is that he speaks into this moment. But it is, we've come to the end of several eras at once. The post-World War II era has ended. I think the Reagan-Clinton era has ended. I think the baby boomers, generation, please God, finally is coming to an end. And at the same time, something unique has begun, which is the internet, and that sounds like a sort of simplistic thing to say, but it's not at all when you think about the fact that the printing press is invented, and the next 300 years are the bloodiest years in the history of Europe, which is saying a lot. But the minute information spreads in a new way, in a further way, and spreads to more people, you start to have these very, very basic battles over what the culture is going to be like. And that, I think, is exactly what's happening now. I think the internet has the force of both the invention of the printing press and the Industrial Revolution happening at the same time. So when you talk about these people being so angry, and you talk about the proliferation of misinformation, it's kind of built into the system. Not only can now everybody spread information, there are no experts. The experts can't be trusted. The little people don't know, the ordinary people don't know what the experts know, but the experts lie. And this is part of why everybody distrusts one another. And at the same time that's happening, you have this distance, which I think is something you got in the Industrial Revolution. You're talking to people online, but they're not really there. And it's really easy to say something on Twitter or TikTok or something and forget that basic golden rule that there actually is another human being on the other side who might have feelings, who might be hurt, who might be inspired to do something stupid. I think we've all lost a little bit of our sense of responsibility to one another. So that is, and when you talk about looking for a hero, I actually believe that heroes define the times. People stand up who represent something, who do things, and it could be for good, it could be for bad, as we know from the last century, and they define where you're going to go from there. And I think, it's very interesting. The last part of the 20th century was pretty good if you were an American. If you were living well and you were in America, it was a pretty good time to be around. But it's easy to forget that the 20th century was one of the bloodiest, worst, ugliest, meanest centuries on the books. And so we really are in this moment of transition when you just have to hope it's going to be a transition that we feel our way through, instead of, the 30 Years' War where we just slaughter each other until finally we get exhausted. It's a scary moment, but it's also an exciting one. And I think, there's plenty of good people out there, and there's plenty of people who remember the golden rule. And so it's going to just be interesting to see whether cometh the hour, cometh the people who will define that hour in a good way. We're just going to have to ride it out and see.
Well, we do. And, as a professional historian, I can say that one reason people, I think, really love historical fiction is we know how it came out. And I often point out to people who are in love with Regency romance, which I'm very fond of, that was a 20-year war and nobody knew how it was going to end until Waterloo. Writers took different choices about how they were going to deal with it. Jane Austen barely referenced it, for example, a criticism often thrown at her. But, why should it be? Because I think she was writing for other purposes, and it was largely peripheral to the things that she wanted to say, even though she had brothers deeply engaged in it. So, at the moment we're having a World War II, just a craze of historical fiction about World War II. And it's shifted from military to really women's stories. I think the predominant stories we're getting about World War II, the librarians and the, women's and all the rest of it, because these are stories we didn't know so much. And the message there is that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can, in fact, step up and be heroic. But I think, no matter how far out pendulums swing, there's an inevitable sort of movement back towards the center. So while we're in this wild swing, we don't know. I lived through, because I was born in 1940, I lived through McCarthy. And I will tell you that for, I think it was 9 years of Joseph McCarthy, it was a nightmare, and nobody thought it would ever end. And then one day it was like Puff the Magic Dragon, I mean, he went from, you know, the czar to nothing almost overnight, sort of like Kanye West, as we're just watching, talk about a fall from grace in what, like 4 days or something, as a entire world, which he, was an unforced error. He deliberately, or anyway, he did blow it up. And the speed with which that can happen, I think the internet has accelerated.
It's incredibly accelerated exponentially. It's interesting that you mentioned Jane Austen, because I think that period has a lot to say to this period. Like us in the 60s, they went through the French Revolution, which they thought was going to bring paradise. They thought it was the age of Aquarius. All the old forms were falling apart and everything was going to be great. And people signed on. And pretty soon it failed, as all utopian revolutions do fail. And as you say, it led to what was essentially the First World War. I mean, the Napoleonic Wars were everywhere. They were just everywhere. And Jane Austen captured something, which was the fact that people were stuck on the island of Britain. There were no more grand tours. That's where you were. You were on this island, and it really was. It was fascinating when the war ended and women got out into Paris. They felt like, oh, gee, we've lost the fashion. We don't know who we are anymore, and all this. All of that. There was this moment of radicalism when gender roles came into question, when marriage came into question, when radicalism was all over the place, and also conservatism on the other side, the rise of the evangelicals. It was very much like this time. And it worked into the Victorian era, which I am not alone in saying this, but sometimes an unpopular opinion. But I think the Victorian era was one of the high points of human culture. And I think that it was certainly a time of, in Britain at least, of confidence and growth and liberalism, of liberalization, as voting rights spread, and women came into their own and all this. And so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. It reminds me very much of this time when we thought the age of Aquarius would come, and it didn't work out that way, as we probably should have known. And in the same way that they had this kind of Napoleonic War, we had this Cold War that worked out for America, with America coming out on top. But still, it's still undecided. And again, a generation is passing away, and a new technology has started. There's just so much in play. But there's reason to be hopeful. I mean, people have come through these things before, and hopefully you do it without just leaving piles of bodies in your wake. That's what I think we're hoping for.
You do, I mean, history is written by the winners and the survivors. So there we go. It's also, about before we get off history, go back to Cameron Winter here. If you actually look, the first 2 decades of almost every century are like this. I mean, if you go back and look, it's amazing how 17th century, you had the 30 Years' War, the 18th century, when financial instruments were coming in, you had the South Sea bubble and all that. 19th century start, we're in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. The 20th century, we're leading right up to World War II. And now here we are, and we have Putin's war and the whole bit. But it's almost like there's a pattern, of where the synthesis is shattered and everybody regroups. And, then there's a kind of coming together and synthesis again, and then new forces arise. But I think, you've made a really interesting point about the impact of the internet being similar to that of the printing press. I mean, I can't go all the way back to like ancient Egypt and figure out, when they wrote the first papyri manuscripts, what did that mean? But disseminating information, communicating, has been central, I think, to all civilization, and it can be disruptive as well as.
It's very disruptive. I mean, people in power like to be in control of the information, and they don't like it, as we found out with the invention of the printing press, when ordinary people get a hold of it. And I think that, the panic about disinformation, obviously there's a lot of truth to it. There's a lot of disinformation, but the disinformation is coming as much from the top as it is from the bottom. And a lot of the people talking about disinformation are disinforming people. And so I think that, it really is a moment when we are going to have to get on this horse and break it. We're going to have to learn to ride it without censorship, without, throwing away the right to speak freely, without throwing away opinions that we may despise, but have a right to be expressed. I mean, all of this does play, I think, into this character and these series of books. I mean, this is this guy for this moment. The America, I tried to do it as unoppressively as I can, but the America he's living in is clearly a dysfunctional place. And he, you talk about the fact that he's not a young man, he's nearing 40, but the books are divided into stories about his youth and about his adulthood. So you actually get to see him in both moments. You get to see him in a more hopeful moment that goes into a dark place, but you also get to see him in this moment when he's thinking, at some level, each of us, it's kind of like the Lord of the Rings. Each of us is born into a time, and we have no say what that time is going to be like, but we have to decide who we're going to be in that time. And that's really what Cameron Winter is about. He's like, who am I going to be in this time that may end up badly or may end up well, but right now it's highly dysfunctional.
It's not just a time, it's a place.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
There's that. We don't have any control over that. And you're right. We have to, do what we can to make the best of it. I have to say that I was truly surprised to see that you wrote a second book about him, because in your long and distinguished history, as you point out, you haven't done that. I was trying to pay attention to, I looked up, it looked to me like your first book, The Face of the Earth, was 1980. So you've been doing this now for 42 years, but it's all grouped up, as you point out. There's the Mind War series, there's the Weiss and Bishop, but they all seem to be trilogies except for John Wells. Now, why did you write as Keith Peterson? What was that all about?
Well, it was a transition. I really didn't know where I was going with my work at all, and I sort of started out thinking I wanted to write more literary novels and even radical novels. And, I was writing books that I didn't even like, but at the same time, I always knew that I was passionate about crime stories. I just loved them. I learned to read off Raymond Chandler. That was really what made me a reader and actually shaped my philosophy. It actually shaped my personality. I mean, that character, the character of the uncorrupt man in a corrupt world, caught my adolescent imagination from the very beginning and made me do what I wanted to do. And I knew I was good at it. So I thought I was going to divide my career up. But then when I started to see that really this was what I was supposed to do, I had this moment when I first read The Woman in White. And I remember I was lying on my bed, and I sat up in bed, and I thought, you really can take this genre and do anything with it. You can actually build into it all the vision that you would put into the kind of literary novels that you're writing that you don't like. And so that was a real big turning point for me. And that was when I started to publish. I think I did one book as Keith Peterson writing as Andrew Klavan, or vice versa. And then I started to just write under my own name. So it was a transitional thing.
Well, let's not get sidetracked into a discussion of why crime fiction actually is literary fiction. But I can tell you that, and I've never forgotten this, in 1995, the only time P.D. James actually came to the store, which started us on our video career, because due to the crowd and so forth, we had to arrange to video it to part of the audience. And so we did our first video event in 1995. And we're still going strong. But I can still remember after she'd given this amazing, passionate, heartfelt discussion of, her book and why she wrote crime fiction and all the rest of it. This guy stood up in the question period and he said to her, "So when are you going to write a real book?" I mean, seriously, and I thought, right. And I really don't like the idea that crime fiction is not literary fiction. For me, the lines, there's such a tendency to put labels on things today, but that's because of, lots of things, internet book selling and all. But, I think Les Miserables, the Brothers Karamazov, whatever. We have just one file at the Poison Pen called fiction, and that's where we put it all. We don't.
I think the one thing about this, because obviously this is a touchy issue for all crime writers who are trying to write the best books they can. The one thing I would say is that genre fiction in general, the crime fiction, horror fiction, that kind of thing, can be good without being literary. That there is such a thing as a great read where you just sit there and you turn the pages and it's fantastic, and then you forget it. You take it to the beach and you forget it. And genre fiction can do that, and it may be not as rich as reading Jane Austen or Crime and Punishment, another book that just transformed my life. But that genre fiction can't be literary is ridiculous. That's absurd. I mean, as you say, Crime and Fiction, one of the greatest novels ever. Crime and Punishment, one of the greatest novels ever written. Also one of the great suspense crime novels in the world. It obviously can be done, and it's just that there is that little extra twist to it that a book can be a great mystery and not be a great book.
Okay, well, I'll buy your point, but then I'm going to turn around and say, in my whole lifetime, I've never been able to read a Booker Prize winner. So
no, I know they're awful. Oh my God, and the Pulitzer Prize.
So color me shallow. I do read story and entertainment. And the other thing I think that people who read crime fiction often read for, it's certainly true of me, is we like to learn things. We're curious, and there's some in the genre that is very much akin to romance, and I don't know that people read that to learn things, but I think your books certainly have always been, I think, appealing to people who are curious about the world and curious about people and what makes them tick. Just to digress even further, talk to me about the movies for a minute, because you've had couple of really successful movies. I was reminded here that True Crime was filmed by Clint Eastwood. Don't Say a Word starred Michael Douglas. What was your experience of working with Hollywood, and did it in any way change your writing?
It didn't change my writing of novels. I had a very interesting experience, which is I never wanted to be in the movie business. I had no interest in it whatsoever. I loved the novel. I've always only really wanted to write novels. I also enjoy writing some nonfiction, but mostly it was wanting to write novels. And at some point, a producer called me up and said, "Your books would make such good movies. I want to pay you to write a screenplay." And I said, "I don't want to do it." And this is something that people will kill their grandmothers to get, an opportunity that people will basically just throw their moms out the window for that opportunity. And I didn't want it. And this producer was so shocked. She said to me, "Is there anything you would do?" And I said, "Well, I'd adapt Simon Brett's Shock to the System," which I just thought was a wonderful, wonderful novel. And she said, "All right." And she went up and she optioned it. So I felt cornered, and I wrote the screenplay, and it was instantaneously made into a Michael Caine movie, which, by the way, is a really good movie. It still stands up to this day. And so that was kind of fun. And so I would do that every now and again. Somebody would call me up, "Would you do a screenplay?" And I'd say, "Okay." And then they started making my books into movies. So Clint Eastwood made True Crime, and Michael Douglas made Don't Say a Word, which was a big hit right after 9/11. It was the first actual big hit right after 9/11. And so I thought, I'm not getting younger. Screenwriting is a young man's game. I'm going to go out to Hollywood and just play around. I'm going to keep writing my novels, but if anybody wants my stuff, I will go out there. And so I had a couple of years where I was really quite successful selling screenplays. That doesn't mean they were making the movies, but I was selling screenplays, which you can make a living at. And it was interesting because it was a way of studying structure. I'm a very, very conscious writer. I write, I know my art well. I've taught myself my craft. I've taught myself my craft quite completely, but movies were different. And so they did have tricks that you learned that you could bring back to the novel, and especially television, which developed at that moment. At the moment I went to Hollywood, television had this golden age, and I was fascinated by the way stories extended themselves. I was fascinated by the way different strains of a story could weave together. And I don't actually think that I would have written a Cameron Winter who I can now turn into a series. I don't think I ever would have done that if I hadn't become fascinated with the structure, especially of television. I learned to write by reading. And in a great novel, I feel, and in a great play and a great movie, a character moves through an arc and he completes that arc and the story is over. And that's why I never went back and thought, oh, I'm going to somehow force this character into a new story. But when I started to watch that, I saw how it was done. And unconsciously, I created this guy, Cameron Winter, where I just thought, oh, wait, that's him. That's the guy I can actually write a series about because he's that interesting. He's got that far a distance to travel. So I think it did have an effect on me, but it wasn't the effect you might think. It wasn't where I started to say, I'm going to write more for the movies, or I'm going to think about what the movie would be like as I write fiction. I never do that.
Yeah, well, but I mean, long form television is an absolute gift, to storytelling. I mean, it seemed to me that the problem with turning a book into a film was that is all the stuff you had to compress or leave out because the film has to be dialogue driven. I mean, it's why Elmore Leonard movies made fabulous. I mean, books made great movies, and Tony Hillerman's made terrible television, because Tony was all interior and Elmore was a genius at dialogue. But the great thing about long form television is that compression where you have to get the whole story down. Ian Rankin and I had this discussion about the rebus, and the original rebus, I don't know if he's ever going to do it, but they took a whole rebus novel, which were complicated, and smushed it down into an hour with or whatever commercials for. And he once said to me, that he'd like to buy them back and then let long form television explore the rebus novels. And I may send you a link to this so we can discuss if you're ever going to do that. But, he was so conscious of the fact that his books were too big and too complicated to be a short presentation, short film presentation.
And I still feel the point that you make about interiority. I mean, I love to write action scenes. I find them incredibly interesting, but they don't matter to me unless I'm in the character. I want the action scenes to be just as meaningful as everything else in a story. And there's that one thing that TV and movies simply cannot do is they cannot go as deeply into a human heart as a novelist can. And that, I think, is where stories actually take place. They take place obviously in the world, and they're fun to watch and they're fun to experience, but where they really take place is in the human heart. And I think that that's something the novels, nothing can match novels for that.
Well, I agree with you, but I'm going to make a recommendation to you that I think is the most brilliant television that I might ever have watched, and people like Scott Terrell are now agreeing with me. It's called Extraordinary Attorney Woo, and it's
I couldn't hear that.
Extraordinary Attorney Woo, WOO. It's actually Korean, and I just can't even begin to tell you how astonishing it is. There's 16. It's one long character, and basically this is a story of a young autistic girl, and how that affects everyone around her, how hard she tries to understand herself and deal with it. But the thing that makes it amazing, you have to watch it to understand this, is the whales. The whales are unbelievable, from which I have derived this incredible respect for Korean storytelling. I would never have worked this one out, but I mean, we sat at the child's bed, we were here doing the Reacher on Monday, and Sunday night we had dinner. We all sat down and watched the first episode of Extraordinary Attorney Woo. So honestly, do what it's on Netflix.
I will. Yeah,
please do, because I think you'll see that somehow or other. And it may have been the combination of the human and then the slightly fantastical that really gets into your heart. But I still cry when she makes her first appearance in court. And, basically you can see right into her heart.
That's great. Yeah.
No kidding. Yeah. It's amazing. But anyway, we've digressed all over the place, and I'm doing a great disservice to this book. So let's go back and talk about, not only do we have the English professor, former spy, man trying to work out how to be a good man in an unjust and difficult world in the whole bit, but we have a shamanic tech mogul. Now I have to ask you, was Elon Musk on your mind when you wrote this? I'm sorry, it's an obvious question.
It might be, but no, I actually was watching. He is a guy who is wholly invented out of my head. His past is completely my construct, and his personality is my construct. But there's just no way. People have asked me about Musk. They've asked me about other guys, and obviously this is a type of person. And one of the things I think the internet has done is it's elevated this particular type of person, a guy who is. I don't want to say autistic because that's not quite right, but somehow separated from the ordinary interchanges of human life, but quite brilliant. And I think that this guy, he starts a social media company. He starts out as kind of a geek, kind of a nerd, not the kind of guy that is really successful romantically or anything like that. And he ends up a gazillionaire, So now he's a powerful guy. He can have anything he wants, and also he has the wherewithal to try to fill his emptiness, the things that have broken in him over the years, and to fix those things any way money can buy. And so it really is interesting to watch him trying to do that. I find him a very sympathetic character, but he's also a character that, Cameron Winter feels he has to go up against, and kind of they have this kind of fatal game of chess that they're playing with each other as they battle with each other. And at the center of his life is this wonderful woman that he has married, that he has taken out of just a kind of normal life that she was living. She was a kind of a normal, ordinary Midwestern church girl. And suddenly this guy sweeps into her life, and the press calls her the Cinderella girl, because now she's a billionaire. Now she's married to a billionaire. And she is so appealing to Winter, and so much of what he's looking for in life, that he's never quite sure whether he's going after Byrne because he's a bad guy, or is he going after him because he has what he wants, and it's a very complicated relationship between them. I'm really excited with the way it came out, and I've been reading some of the reviews on Amazon and things where people are just really reacting to it, because he is a character that we recognize. Gerald Byrne, the billionaire, is a guy we recognize. He's in our newspapers all the time, and yet this is kind of his inner life and his inner world that becomes, for Winter, a sort of quest that he has to sort of get to the truth of.
So are the women, actually. Mackenzie Scott, for example, or, sorry, I'm going blank on the Microsoft guy. Bill, what's her name? Bill Gates is fine.
Bill and what's her name?
Yeah, but I mean, you're right that money, that kind of money, changes the whole world for people. When I was young, I loved the Oz books. They were my drug of choice. And the first time I actually understood mortality was when I realized one day when I was maybe 10 that I was never going to get to go to Oz. I mean, I'm serious. I really thought up until then, that at some point I would go to Oz. And when I recognized I couldn't, it taught me a lot about the world. But I've always remembered that, Ozma, who was all powerful, the Queen of Oz and all, and she had this magic wand. And every once in a while, one of the characters like Dorothy, would want it. And Ozma would never relinquish it, because she, understood that kind of power was, that it was almost impossible to wield that kind of power without corruption or without, destruction following it. And, that was a lesson I learned when I was just a child reading those books. But it's true. Today's, Napoleons are actually tech giants.
Yeah, it's absolutely true that the guys who have the most power over the flow of information, which is everything right now, and this is a guy who is like aware of that, and he's trying to become maybe more. He's looked for spirituality in his life. He's looked for all kinds of ways to end the pain of a very tragic childhood that he had, and I find him a really kind of riveting character, and I find their battle really riveting. But I have to say also, one of the things that has taken me by surprise about these two Winter novels, and I've already written a draft of the third one, is how central to the story the women are. In fact, I almost think that the women in the books have more, I don't know, weight, I guess, emotional weight than the men do. They are that around which everything revolves. And Molly in this story, Jennifer in the other story, and Winter's therapist, who is his mother figure, and who basically is kind of re-raising him, kind of taking him back through his youth and bringing him up again. And they're just like, to me, I've kind of written typically kind of macho novels, kind of hard-boiled novels that's centered on what men think and what men are doing and all this stuff. And these books are very much about the other side of that, about the women. And I think that Winter finds himself really, I won't say baffled, but mesmerized by the importance of women in his life, because what he is looking for ultimately is to be able to love and to be able to feel that he can be loved, because he feels kind of bad about his life. And I think that to me is the most interesting part of Gerald Byrne, this billionaire, is this relationship he has with a quote unquote ordinary woman who is, as Chesterton might have pointed out, he said there's nothing more extraordinary than an ordinary man and an ordinary woman. And I think that she is in fact extraordinary. And Winter at one point says, I wonder how many women there are like her who no one will ever know about, because they didn't marry a billionaire, because they had a different path in life, because he's so taken with her majesty, and so is the word he uses, but it's the majesty of an ordinary person. And it's just, to me, she's the heart of the book, no question about it.
Well, that's an interesting point, because if you look back at Mackenzie Scott, she didn't marry Jeff Bezos when he was a billionaire. I mean, yeah. they were hardly even middle class. And then somehow or other, it all happens. So she had to ride along with it and either grow into it or stop. And, in your case, making a conscious decision to marry money is a lot different than having money overtake you, or having having fame overtake you. We've watched the arc of fame overtake people in 33 years of running the Poison Pen. And I can say truthfully, and I think most of the time, failure is easier to withstand than success.
It's a really, really interesting point. I mean, this is, this last section of my life has been so public and has involved getting recognized on the street and all this stuff. And you start to think, you really do have to sort of come back into yourself, because it is kind of a little ego burst all the time. And it brings me back. It's funny. Just the other night, I was sitting around with a bunch of pals, and we were smoking cigars and drinking, and started talking about this subject. And we all had very strong, very happy, very long-lasting marriages, but they had all started when we were broke. And we were so glad that our wives, who had both believed in us and supported us and supported our dreams and helped us succeed our dreams, could also turn to us and say, "Hey, don't be a schmuck. Like pull it in and come back to life." And we were all so grateful for that in our lives, because it matters to me. Nothing matters more than the love in your life and the way you are as a human being. And so I think that it's, to me, marriage and the relationship between men and women that is so key to everything, and which right now is in such confusion, I just think is another part of this fascinating moment that we're in. And so this marriage, which is a marriage, but of an ordinary woman to a billionaire, it is just kind of really interesting. It has a real depth to it, and really speaks into the moment, I think.
So there's a line here we can't talk too much about the plot, because, obviously we've been all over the place avoiding the plot. But I do like, there's a sentence that kind of gets you going here, which is, we've talked about Gerald Byrne, the visionary philanthropist and devoted husband and father, devoted to good works. And then comes this sentence, and every person who gets in the way of his good work seems to die. Ooh. Ooh, you can turn a whole book on that. Often I ask people about, the instigating incident. But it seems to me that it isn't just an incident in this book that really, pushes, because a crime novel does need a crime, I
Yeah,
mean, if
yeah.
you're going to call it one. And Andrew, has been nominated 5 times for the Edgar for excellence of his work and won too. So it's not like you don't understand successful crime fiction or know how to write it. But is the premise of this one somewhat different than, let's just say, finding the body or witnessing, or whatever it is?
Yep, there's no question. It's constructed purposely differently because I want this to be a series. I want each book to be unique. I don't want to, just have each thing be the same story over and over again. With here's a body who done it, and this one starts very, very differently. It starts with a suicide. In fact, that's the first 3 pages, and it's one of the things that's very important to me is this is, if you had to put it if you had to categorize this is an amateur sleuth. This is a guy who is not a cop. It doesn't follow Ed McBain's wonderful line where he said, I write about police because when a murder happens, I'm not going to call an old woman who knits. I thought, okay, here's a guy who, as he repeatedly says throughout the books, is an English professor. All he wants to do is talk about and read romantic poetry from the Romantic era in England. But the crimes that capture his imagination have to do it for a reason. They have to. It can't just be, oh, my old friend, suddenly got murdered, or I was at a country house for Christmas and somebody wound up dead. I don't want it to be that. I want it to be something that speaks right directly into what he's trying to accomplish in his own life. And this is a kid who was one of his students a long time ago, who got burned, basically got thrown out of his school, who just throws himself off the top of a building. And so the last thing he does before he kills himself is he texts his old professor, his old mentor, and says, help me, I need help. And Winter can't understand why he doesn't wait for a reply. He sends that text and then he just goes off the roof. And so he is drawn into this, but it's this that leads him to this, incredibly rich, incredibly powerful social media guy, and who is a philanthropist and as you say, a husband and father, and like he's all those things that you want to admire. And so it's really this, why did this kid get to the point of suicide, which is a really desperate thing to do, and what does it have to do with this man who is living in a totally other stratosphere from the guy who killed himself? And that to me is like a good puzzle, and becomes a very interesting, like I said, it's a game of chess. These two guys, the minute they meet each other on the cliffs above San Francisco, and the minute they meet each other, they look at one another and think, okay, here we go, it's on, and we are going to take each other down. They're both brilliant. They have their own sources of power, and it really is a kind of struggle between these two guys, and that's why it starts in the frontispiece with the Kipling quote, "And two strong men stand face to face. All other things disappear."
So you did give Winter a superpower of his own to kind of even things out with the money, which is then his ability to visualize a scene. So, there have been sleuths that have synesthesia or have, other sorts of powers. To what do you attribute Winter's ability to, to do that?
Well, this is his strange habit of mind, which is that essentially he has the power, and it's an amazing power to have. Almost no one does have it. It does exist, but he has the power to put aside all his opinions. He has the power to put aside everything he thinks and everything he believes and everything he holds dear, and simply look at the furniture floating around the room until the furniture lands and takes a shape. And that, I think, is what makes him interested in poetry as well, because it's what, he loves the romantics. And one of the romantics was John Keats, who believed in negative capability, which was the ability to basically see beyond good and evil, and just to see the vitality of life, the gusto of life, Keats called it. And Winter partakes about a little of that. He is a romantic in his own way, and he partakes of that. And so he is capable of looking at these things. Here's this guy who's so rich and so powerful, and has this woman that Winter, it's not that Winter's in love with his wife, it's just she is the kind of, that love is the kind of thing he's looking for. So he's jealous of him, he has all that, and yet at occasional moments he has the power to put all that aside and just look at what's happening and look at the facts and the way they move. And when he comes back to himself, it's not that he solved the crime, it's that he now sees it in a much more clear way and a much more honest way. And that to me also speaks into this thing that's in him that he's looking for. He's trying to find that thing in him that allows him to do that, that is creative and beautiful and loves beauty and also is capable of love and of receiving love. It's a very difficult thing for a man to do, and especially a man who has, it's later in life, he's in his late 30s, and he's already past the point when you kind of develop as a human being, and now to re-raise himself and regenerate who he is, very tough thing to do, and all these crimes kind of speak into that.
Wow, I can certainly see what a good time you're having with this.
Yeah, no, he lit my fire, no question about it.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely wonderful, because when I've talked to you in the past, you've been, shall I say, more detached. Yeah, I mean, Andrew and I do have a long history, just been interrupted, but I'm very pleased that we have had a chance to talk again. Why don't we get Jacob to come in, Andrew, and tell us if there are any comments or questions from the audience before we go on too long.
All right.
There he comes. Hello.
Andrew, yeah, I do have a few questions. Mark Sussex asks, which book did you win the Edgar for?
I won the Edgar for two books. One was called Mrs. White, which I co-wrote with my brother, and the other was called The Rain, which was one of my Keith Peterson books, and still it's quite a good one. It holds up very well. It's an old-fashioned tough guy mystery.
Cool. When was that, by the way? Those two books.
It was in the 80s, in the 1980s. Yeah. Okay. So but I've been nominated 3 more times since then. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Were they all in the same category, Andrew?
No, one was a short story. I think that was the last time I was nominated, and I've been nominated for all of them, all of the awards. But the last Edgar Award was in the 2000s sometime. I can't remember.
Okay. How much of yourself do you see in Winter as a character? Or how much of yourself did you pour into the character, whether that be your personality or personal beliefs? Is there kind of a younger Andrew in Winter?
Well, I always compare
Jacob.
I always compare it to yeast. You put a little bit of yourself into every character, and that brings him to life. But that's true of whether it's a male or female, old or young. But I do think with Winter, I mean, I do love the Romantic poets. So there is that connection. He is a man out of his time, and I've always felt a little bit like that myself. And I think he is looking. I'm looking back at him. I mean, he's a younger man. He's dealing with things that I've already dealt with, which I think is helpful to me. But he's also very different than me. He's completely apolitical. He is very much an agnostic. He really hasn't come down on any side about this, but he's open to exploring the ideas. So he is a different person than I am. He's probably more elegant than I am. But there are places, it's like a Venn diagram. There are places where we do intersect.
Okay, great. I guess that kind of ties into the next question. So what kind of research did you do for the novel? Is there, or what took the most time? Because obviously you can draw inspiration from yourself, from your past. But what really took the most time, the most energy to research?
I think the two things, one is, of course, I wanted to know about the internet and what it takes to build this, but I didn't want it to become so detailed. I'm not the kind of writer who wants to give you a lesson in some aspect of, technology or something like that. But I wanted to have a complete feeling of what it was like to be, how you became this social media giant. And I go by the kind of Hemingway dictum that if you write the tip of the iceberg, but you have to know what the iceberg looks like underneath. So that took a lot of research. And one of the things that Gerald Byrne does, which is one of my favorite parts of the book, is he uses ayahuasca, which is a drug that people use. They travel to the Amazon to use it, and it has this effect of they feel enlightened by it. And he has this very big turning point. And so that was something, I couldn't travel to the Amazon, and I certainly wasn't going to take it because I don't really take drugs at all. But I wanted to research that experience so that I felt like I could create it from the inside. And that took a lot of time because it's such an internal experience and such a mystical experience that I wanted to make sure I got it right. I wanted to make sure I wasn't dismissive of it, but at the same time could see it coldly and clearly. So that really took a lot of research.
Okay, great. Well, is there any particular reason for the shamanic thing that he has going on? I mean, I was just about to say that it reminds me of all these rich and famous people going to Cusco and doing, ayahuasca and then coming back and then, sharing their experiences. I mean, does that kind of tie into the theme of religion kind of throughout the novel? Because it seems to me there's some sort of dichotomy between that traditional, more Western attitude to things and the more kind of new age, spiritual, new psychedelic paganism that's going around.
Absolutely. I mean, that is one of the things about these two guys who are in conflict. Like any two big men who come into conflict, they're going to find a lot of similarities. I think it is the similarities that bring us into conflict a lot of times. And so, here is again, just as Winter is looking for love and Gerald Byrne has love, he's also looking for whether he's asking himself whether there is some spiritual ground on which he can stand. And so that it becomes a question to him. Gerald Byrne feels that this stuff has really helped him and this experience has really changed him and dispelled some of his demons. And Winter wants to know if that's worthwhile. And so, yeah, it's definitely part of this experience. And yet I think even more part of that is Molly, who's like, who's a Christian and a very, very solid person in that way. So he's very taken with her as well. And all of those things are examples of things that he's kind of sampling and looking for and become part of his search, but also part of this battle that he's in.
Okay. And then one last one. You kind of hinted at some of the social commentary within the novel, particularly like the lack of heroes and, the kind of the crisis of masculinity in the 21st century, how to be a good man. Are there any other kind of contemporary issues that are explored within the novel that you'd like to talk about? Or
Well, certainly what Barbara and I were talking about the internet and the incredibly powerful effect it's had on everything. I can't remember, David Bowie, I think it was, who said the internet, just as it was starting, he said it's an actual creature, it's an actual foreign intelligence, an alien intelligence, I think was a word he used. And so that is very much part of this. I mean, the way that information spreads, because after all, when Winter goes after somebody, when he's looking at something, he spends a lot of time on the internet. He spends a lot of time looking people up and how much of people there is on the internet, how much they show, how much they reveal, but also you can hide a lot of things by revealing everything. You can pretend, you can make it look as if you're just as open as can be, but that actually is a disguise. Naked is the best disguise, as they used to say. And so I think that issue, is probably the key issue in the book. I think there is a lot about masculinity and femininity. I think that those are both questions and issues in the book. But that idea that information is power and information is now like completely democratized in some way, and the effect of that and the effect of every single person having the right to spread information. And yet you have these powerful guys who can act as stopgaps and censors and manipulate things. And I think all of that it plays into it. And I think that's an issue, that obviously dominates the book. Again, Winter is an apolitical guy. His only politics has to do with the 18th century, which is when the literature that he loves was written. But in this sense, it has this politics of what effect this monster, this alien intelligence, is going to have, not just on the people in the book, but on all of us.
There's a corollary I will add before we sign off, which we see at the store a lot when people come to meet authors and so forth. This device and its camera really means that everyone can now be the hero of his own story and publish it. And, Jacob hasn't seen a lot of it because we haven't had these really monster events where, you have somebody celebrated, and it's really fascinating to watch how people behave. But what they really want is the photo. They really want some evidence so they can tell a story of which they're going to be the hero, right? They went to this and, touch this person, so to speak, and the whole bit. And, I think that's ordinary people didn't have that ability, down the ages. I mean, history's about extraordinary people most of the time, or people who made enough noise or whatever it might be. But now through, platforms and with this little device and the whole bit, everyone can create a story about themselves and publish it.
And it's an interesting thing. I can't say what it means, but it is an interesting thing that, some people will come up to you and ask for your autograph, and people like signed books. But most people, when they approach you on the street, they want to take your picture. They want a picture of you with them. And
that's why, because that means that they have evidence, so to speak, for their story. And I was reading something about one of these mass shooters the other day, whatever his note was that he left behind. And it was clear that part of the motivation for him is that he didn't feel famous. He hadn't had any way to make himself visible and tell his story. So therefore he went out to do the worst thing he could think of for that moment. And I think that this technology is promoting behavior that we may not have seen before, because people didn't have access to that kind of storytelling structure, personal storytelling structure. So we'll see.
And the combination, I mean, fame used to be something that meant that you would be remembered after you were gone. But now we have this other thing that we call fame, which is really just celebrity. And when you have the combination of people who don't believe it matters what happens after you're gone, and the fact that celebrity is instantaneous and international, it's a big temptation.
I think the whole concept of people having actual jobs as influencers, I mean, I can hardly wrap Jacob, probably it's fine for you, but I'm still having trouble with the idea that you can make an actual career out of being an influencer, and people will pay you to put on makeup in public and other stuff. Just amazing. And next, Andrew, we're going to have robots in our own homes doing tasks. So you have plenty to write about as you move forward with all this.
Oh, yeah.
And on that note, I think probably we've gone on long enough. So let me once again thank Andrew for his time. Point out that he has signed copies of this marvelous book, A Strange Habit of Mind. And I'm happy to say we don't have autographed copies, but the book that came before for winter, called When Christmas Comes, is still available. So congratulations, Andrew. What a wonderful thing to have come into this kind of storytelling moment.
Yeah, it's been amazing and exciting. It's so nice to see you, Barbara. I hope to actually get there in person before too long.
Well, if not in person, we can do this again. At least we know for sure you're writing book 3. So that's an encouraging sign, right?
Always happy to show up. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good night, everybody. And